One thing that many people don't realize is that the gears of our federal government, and quite frankly, most of the way that Congress works, they just grind inexhaustibly in a liberal direction. You have to realize that the vast majority of our federal agencies are staffed by Democrats. Now, look, the reality is that many of those people are career civil servants, or in the State Department, you have career civil servants and foreign service officers. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the demographics surrounding DC, this area is 90% Democrat voters. Yeah. So who do you think those people voted for, right? And we know who they voted for, right? The entire State Department was expecting the coronation of Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And many folks at the State Department were hoping to go to the National Security Council, to go to the White House. So there was great weeping and gnashing of teeth at the State Department, in particular after Trump won. So when you come in there as a Trump appointee and somebody who is unapologetically pro-Trump and willing to help him execute his agenda, you're a pariah immediately. I mean, and they look at you like you don't belong there, right? These folks, particularly the folks who populate our foreign service officers, regiment, are people who are like elite educated, coastal elites, Harvard, Yale, Ivy, and they don't see the world the same way that Trump does.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. I'm your host, Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment, and today I am joined by William Wolfe. But before I get to introducing William, I got to make my, traditional plug for American Moment. You can find all things American Moment at americanmoment.org. Imagine that. You can follow us on Twitter. Actually, I think basically all social media platforms at ammoment.org. On our website and various social media platforms, you'll find more information about all of our programming. Our Fellowship for American Statecraft, Foundations of American Statecraft, AM Fridays, AM Canon, which is our content generation and collation platform. A lot of really cool stuff on our website. We're going to be very busy this year working on a lot of new initiatives. Today, we had on William Wolfe, who, if you spend any time on Twitter at all, can be tweeting about anything from, Ukraine to Christian nationalism to pictures of his cute kids. It's like he's all over the place, but he's a really, really fun follow and is doing a lot of interesting work. We had a very fascinating conversation today. We covered his time working at the State Department and the Department of Defense. So kind of the first half of the episode, we talk about how you can get a job in a future presidential administration, how that works, what the deep state was trying to do to prevent a lot of the president's policies. And then the latter half of the episode, we spent talking about Christian nationalism, the new boogeyman for the mainstream media. It was a very, very entertaining episode. William's a really cool guy, and we really look forward to following his progress over the next couple of years. William is a 10-year veteran of the conservative political movement. He served as a senior official in the Trump administration, both as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon and a Director of Legislative Affairs at the Department of State. Prior to his service in the administration, William worked for Heritage Action for America and as a congressional staffer for 3 different members of Congress, including the former Congressman Dave Brat. He has a bachelor's in history from Covenant College and a Masters of Divinity at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Combining his political experience and theological education, William plans to pursue a PhD with a focus on Christian ethics and public theology, enter pastoral ministry, and engage at the intersection of faith and politics, cultural commentary, and Christian worldview issues. Originally from outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, he is married to Lauren Wolfe, and they have 3 boys, Evan, Jack, and Daniel. We will go now to William Wolfe. William, thanks for coming on the pod.
Thanks for having me. Been looking forward to it.
So, you know how we like to start the show, ask more about our guest background, how they got where they are. Who is William Wolfe? What's his deal? He's foreign policy, he's Christian politics, he's everywhere. What's your story?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Good chance to introduce myself to the American Moment audience. Really thankful for your organization and what you guys are doing. I think it's a critical piece of sort of the future of the new right. I don't know if you align yourself with that, but whatever hopes we have for hopefully a better staffed Republican administration, I greatly appreciate that, considering some of the people I had to work with in the previous administration.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm from North Carolina originally, but then I went to college in Georgia at Covenant College, PCA college. I studied history. I thought about, my goal was to be a lawyer. And I don't know, I might still go to law school. We'll see. But then I moved to DC a couple of years after I graduated, came here primarily to go to a church after I became a Christian, and went to Capitol Hill Baptist Church. And the job sort of followed suit. I came here for a church, but then I needed work. And in a pretty unconventional fashion, I think, back then when you could just walk into congressional office buildings, I literally just put on a suit and tie, printed off my resume, looked up North Carolina offices, and just walked straight in and dropped my resume off.
Wow.
And I got a call back from one of them, not with a job offer, but with an unpaid internship.
Nice.
And I took it. And because, I was just starting out. And so I took that unpaid internship, and then I got a job waiting tables. And so I waited tables nights and weekends, unpaid internship in the congressional office.
Where did you wait tables?
PF Chang's up at
Nice.
Friendship Heights.
That's quite a hike from here.
Yeah,
right?
it was a big red line trip. But it was great, man. And what it was, you could call it a life sustainability job. Now, I know that these days a lot of internships are paid around here, but as I have counseled people looking to get work in DC, I tell them you kind of need to be here. Like, you need to move here and be committed to that. And then if you're doing something like an unpaid internship, get a job that supports you until a full-time job materializes. So then I got hired as a legislative correspondent in the office of Rick Berg from North Dakota. He ran against Heidi Heitkamp in 2012.
Yep.
And so election night 2012, I'm in Fargo, North Dakota, and
Nice.
my first job went away because he did not win that. So then I actually got hired back to the office of Congresswoman Virginia Fox as a legislative correspondent for them. Worked for her for a couple of years. And then became a legislative assistant for Dave Brat, sort of hero of the conservative movement. It's fascinating, Nick, if you look at the issues that Dave Brat ran on in that surprise insurgent primary victory against Cantor, it was two main things: immigration restriction that benefits Americans, and an economic policy that benefits our country as a whole. Essentially the two main issues that Trump ran on. Yeah. Trump, he was just sort of like a forerunner for Trump. So then I worked for him, had a chance to go work at Heritage Action with Russ Vogt over there back in the heyday.
So you guys have known each other for like a long time.
Oh yeah, Russ has been sort of like a political mentor for me in many ways.
Awesome.
Speaking about, for those who might not know, speaking about Russ Vogt, he runs the Center for Renewing America, and he was the director of the Office of Management and Budget for Trump. He's
and a
fantastic.
former Moment of Truth guest.
And a former Moment of Truth guest, maybe a future one. Yeah. So then I had a chance to work in the Trump administration. So maybe it was because I worked for Dave and I sort of saw those similarities. But when Trump came down that escalator, I thought, this guy's got a real shot of going all the way. And I really liked his policies, quite frankly. I was thrilled he won. Election night 2016, honestly, after the way that year went, felt like one of the greatest vindications of my political instincts I've ever experienced. And I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way. And so I jumped at the chance to try to work in his administration. And so what that looked like was volunteering for the Presidential Transition Organization, which is a little entity that gets stood up, and you become an employee of that, but you don't get paid necessarily. I wasn't paid. And so I just went over there sort of like reverse. I worked my day job at Heritage Action, then went over there nights and weekends. And by doing that, I was able to get my name on a list as a potential political appointee. And through God's grace and some providence, I ended up landing at the State Department.
And how does that whole process work? You hear a lot about the transition and a lot about, in Trump's case specifically, about how that was kind of where some of these staffing issues started to go wrong. So what does that look like from your name being on a list to like actually being in
an agency?
Appointed? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, Trump, we've hardly seen anything like Trump in political history before. I mean, the man was a true outsider, right? Never held an elected, role in his life before he became president of the United States. And one of the things that really hamstrung Trump, it's not his fault, but the reality is that the establishment figures who were there to help him out through that first transition weren't looking out for the interests of the Trump base, of the people that put him into office. And so there was a lot of issues, from the get with the people that got into the administration. But so the way that it works is, it's funny. I was offered the first people that get into the administration are come in on what's called Wave 1 beachhead, and those people go in like on noon on Inauguration Day. And I was actually offered a spot for Wave 1 beachhead at the Department of Agriculture, but I had no interest in going to the Department of Agriculture, so I turned that down, which was a little bit risky. And so I think my name ended up on a list for like Wave 3 at the State Department. And so then you're just kind of waiting to see what has to happen is you get a White House liaison that works for the administration embedded in an agency. And then they communicate with the Office of Presidential Personnel and then the respective offices within those agencies. And then they put politicals in there. And, you have to be agreed, the office director, say the secretary, has to agree to hire you. White House has to sign off on it. White House liaison has to sign off on it. So it's kind of like firing a nuke. You got to put in 3 keys. And for me, the way that it worked is that I had a buddy who went in to be Rex Tillerson's first speechwriter. And he knew that the Legislative Affairs Office needed help. And so the lady who was the Assistant Secretary of Legislative Affairs, Mary Waters, he sent her my resume. So there's step 1. Mary Waters gets my resume. And she says, I need help doing House affairs here at the State Department. So she brings me in for an interview. Then I talk to PPO, then the White House liaison. And that's how you make it in. So it's quite a combination. But at the end of the day, here in DC, it always comes down to who do you know? Who can put in that call for you, right? Who can get your resume in front of somebody?
Well, and the other thing, too, is that, people don't realize, I think, sometimes how compressed and also how long this process can be drug out. So how long did it take in your instance?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it took a couple months, right? Particularly if you're going in somewhere where you need a security clearance. And that's what I was doing. So I had to go through the entire process to get a TSSCI security clearance. And so I have to fill out all that paperwork, and that has to get adjudicated, come in for an interview. And then for me, I think from sort of start to finish, it took a couple months. I mean, I landed, I was on the ground working in April 2017. So I joke, I say I did 45 for 45 months. Not quite the full 4 years, but essentially that. But, as the administration goes on, it really can take months. Like once say an agency wants to hire an individual and then the process of getting all those sign-offs. So I tell people who look to work in the administration to be patient, but be ready, because when it's time to go, they'll get you in there as quick as possible.
Yeah. To go back to the, you said your first offer was at the Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
So how does that, do they take your interest on the front end, or was it, someone just knew you, or they were just randomly placing people? Like, what does that look like?
Folks who were working on the transition knew where staffing needs were, right? And I guess there were just a need to put trusted conservatives somewhere at like agriculture.
Got it.
But that just wasn't my policy interest, and it never has been. My policy interests have always been sort of America first issues, and that includes foreign policy, immigration policy, and then here on our home soil, issues pertaining to religion, public morality, freedom of speech. And so I was interested in going places like state or DHS or DOJ, even though I don't have a legal background to do like policy work. But agriculture just wasn't what I wasn't cutting that. Yeah.
So when you land, in the administration, April 2017, you're doing congressional relations.
Yeah, legislative affairs.
What is that like? I mean, especially like Trump's foreign policy 2017, if I'm remembering correctly, there's a lot of like congressional pushback and probably pushback, internally.
That's right.
So tell us, I guess, about both those things.
Yeah. Well, one thing that many people don't realize is that the gears of our federal government, and quite frankly, most of the way that Congress works, they just grind inexhaustibly in a liberal direction. You have to realize that the vast majority of our federal agencies are staffed by Democrats. Now, look, the reality is that many of those people are career civil servants, or in the State Department, you have career civil servants and foreign service officers. But if you look at the demographics surrounding DC, this area is 90% Democrat voters.
Yeah.
So who do you think those people voted for, right? And we know who they voted for, right? The entire State Department was expecting the coronation of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And many folks at the State Department were hoping to go to the National Security Council, to go to the White House. So there was great weeping and gnashing of teeth at the State Department, in particular after Trump won. So when you come in there as a Trump appointee and somebody who is unapologetically pro-Trump and willing to help him execute his agenda, you're a pariah immediately. I mean, and they look at you like you don't belong there, right? These folks, particularly the folks who populate our foreign service officers, regiment, are people who are like elite educated, coastal elites, Harvard, Yale, Ivy, and they don't see the world the same way that Trump does. So it was pretty fascinating. One story I'll tell you, which really opened my eyes, was in my first couple of weeks there, I was taking a group of individuals up to Capitol Hill to brief the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So that was kind of our main job, right? We liaison with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We brief the staffers, brief the members. And Trump proposed some pretty drastic budget cuts to the State Department in particular, 30% reduction. And on the way up there, these individuals, career civil servants who work program managers and foreign service officers, did not know I was a political appointee. And they were talking in that car the whole time about how they were going to undermine what the president was wanting and sort of give Congress the tools to help prevent Trump from executing his vision, and at that point, Secretary Tillerson, his vision for the State Department. And it just really opened up my eyes to, I guess, what you could call the collusion of your career civil servants and foreign service officers with primarily congressional Democrats, or quite frankly, congressional Republicans, who want things to maintain, they want the status quo maintained.
And what is that like dragging of their feet and obstruction look like on a day-to-day basis? Like, what kinds of things do they use to do that?
Yeah, well, the interagency process, or even an intra-agency process, like within one agency of policymaking, they can grind and slow stuff up, incredibly. And so what it looks like is, it looks at the very beginning, if Trump says something like, "Hey, we need to reduce, our footprint here or there," right? Then the program managers, or say Trump says like, "Hey, look, we're spending money on like promoting LGBT agenda in South America," right? This like goes against their interests. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. Well, then the first thing that whoever is, in the Western Hemisphere Affairs Office does is they draft some memo defending sort of why that's in our interest. We've always been doing this, or we've been doing it for 5 years. Congress appropriated this money. We have to spend it this way. And so just the obstruction begins at the lowest level and works its way up. I was talking to some former appointees yesterday as well. And one of the things that's really interesting is how important the deputy secretary is in every organization. Because say Trump says to, Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Pompeo, or whoever, like, "Hey, make this change at your department." The first thing that secretary does is kick it to the deputy secretary, because the way it works is the secretary of an agency is sort of the outward, forward-facing individual, and the deputy manages everything within the agency. And so by the time something has worked its way up, a proposed policy change to the deputy secretary, if he has not been ensuring that it's going in the right direction, I can almost guarantee that memo, which is going to have like 20 clearance lines on it, is going to say, keep doing the same thing. And so then the deputy has to go fight all the way down the food chain to make that change. And so if you don't have a politically committed deputy secretary, again, these agencies are going to resist the changes that like someone like Trump would have proposed.
Yeah. What were, in your opinion, some of the biggest battles of your time there? And like the LGBTQIA, plus whatever rights in South America is fun. The way these people defend this sort of thing is it's like, we've been promoting gender studies, in Kabul since 1776, baby.
Right.
Like we've been doing this forever. What were some of the biggest fights that you had to take on?
Well, I mean, the biggest one right out of the gate, particularly for the State Department, was this proposed reduction in our footprint, in our overall presence. It was like a 30% reduction in reorganization that was proposed, which is desperately needed. The State Department is wildly inefficient, and we spend billions of dollars every year on foreign policy aims and initiatives that return no discernible benefit to the American people. It's sort of just this ongoing grift, between these international, agencies and organizations that get USAID money or State Department money. So that was a huge fight right out of the gate. And then, other issues too in the foreign policy sphere was just sort of Trump's constant desire that everything we do would benefit America. So I think of, I ended up over at DOD too. And towards the end of the administration, Trump was proposing reducing our footprint in Africa, reducing some of our footprint in Europe as well. And again, that's just an absolute knife fight, because all the congressional interests want to stop that. Everybody in the national security apparatus wants to stop that. And so at every step of the way, you're fighting to help enact this policy that the president wants, because he believes that was the mandate given to him by the American people. And you just have to fight the interests every step of the way. So
I want to talk a little bit about the reason behind that, why there's such a you think about liberals, and you should think, frequently in American history, they're more dovish, they're less predisposed to going to war. But these days it's weird. All the liberals love being all over the world in all places at all times, fighting all these wars, doing all these covert actions. Why do you think that, why are they so resistant to this, idea that we would want to be a nation at peace and that that's good for the American people?
Yeah, I think that, obviously coming out of, it's hard to underscore how it really was America that got to set the course of the modern world after World War II. Europe was devastated, Japan devastated, Germany devastated, and Americans own the world after World War II, until sort of we move into the Cold War era. And obviously we have some pretty major setbacks with Vietnam and Korea. We lose and draw. And but we got to reshape sort of the modern world, and really these ideas of what's called an open society, which comes from this book by this guy Karl Popper, who wrote a defense of sort of this open society and how to prevent a World War III. And it's called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Well, I'll let you know, we're the enemies of the open society. And actually, interestingly enough, George Soros actually wrote an introduction to a later edition of this book. The Soros programs are called the Open Society programs. And it was this idea that we have to downplay national loyalties and identities. But anyway, all this sort of leads into the idea of sort of America as the exporter of liberal democracy and open societies. And everywhere that, there's entrenchment against that, we need to get involved and sort of we need to go make Afghanistan a liberal democracy. And of course, our reasons for going to Afghanistan in 2001 were very justifiable. But then what we did for 20 plus years after that was try to restructure Afghanistan from a civic, perspective into our own image. And the reality is they're not going to govern themselves like that. It's incredibly corrupt. So all that to say is essentially it's the America as the exporter of liberal democracy and open society. And there is, I would say, a very sort of disingenuous way that people on the right and left talk about someone like me or others, Trump's foreign policy as being sort of retreatist. And it's not that. It's when Trump was in office, our allies respected us and our enemies feared us. And he was honestly one of the most successful foreign policy presidents I think we've ever had.
No, I totally agree with that. The slur that I always seen thrown around is isolationist.
Yeah, isolationist.
That's the one. You just want to close your country, not have to deal with anybody else, and just do whatever you want. Whereas, he went all over the world.
We killed Soleimani.
Yeah, brought world leaders here. I think, frankly, many of them were probably terrified of him, of what he might do. I'm curious to hear more about your time. I know that state and DOD are, kind of go together. They're interconnected in a lot of ways. Tell us about how you ended up in this role at DOD, what tell us about your super fancy title and what your responsibilities were.
Yeah, sure. So after about 3 years at the State Department, I started out as a congressional advisor there. And, I was reflecting upon my time in the administration and sort of just like key takeaways that I would give folks looking to sort of, enter into an administration as a political appointee and to succeed if they can, which is tough, And so I kind of, at first I did two things, two H's, head down and hard work, right? Just try to keep my head down. When you're in those earlier entry roles, you can't change things so much, but what you can do is gather information. You can channel that information in productive ways to particularly folks outside of that agency or political connections at the White House who need to know what's happening under their watch, right? Like in the ways that the agencies are revolting against them. So put your head down, do hard work. And so I was a congressional advisor, and then eventually I was promoted to be the director of House Affairs. So I was the director of House Affairs in this Office of Legislative Affairs at the State Department. And again, my main role there was liaisoning with the House Foreign Affairs Committee, working with staffers and members to, advocate and defend the Trump administration's foreign policy goals, prepare ambassadors for testimony. I tell people like, hey, you see these pictures of these people testifying at Congress? Well, I was one of the guys sitting behind them. Right?
Oh, yeah. They're always making fun of the guy, like making the weird face.
That's right.
Or like whatever.
I actually got there's a pretty sweet photo. Brian Hook was the sort of special representative on Iran at the State Department. And again, like talk about the false charge of isolationists. We ran an incredibly brutal and extracting pressure campaign on Iran, trying to prevent them from pursuing, nuclear capabilities. And we crushed them when we were in office. And now again, Obama empowered them, Trump crushed them, and now Biden's empowering them again. That's not pro-democracy.
Yeah.
But Brian Hook was testifying, and I'm sitting there behind him with a guy from the White House too, and Code Pink, the anti-war protesters are there, and they're like holding up these big signs behind us. It's just this great picture of Brian, me, and then like Code Pink.
You'll have to send me that. We can put it in the videos.
For sure. So I was the director of House Affairs, and then the guy who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for House Affairs over at the Pentagon in the Office of the Secretary of Defense was moving on. And folks thought I would be a good fit for that job. And so I interviewed for that and was able to move on over to the Defense Department in that role.
And would this have been under Pompeo?
Well, I was at State. I was under Tillerson and Pompeo. Yep. When I went over to DOD, Esper was the secretary.
Oh, Esper. Right.
And so every DOD is massive, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely massive. So every service branch has their own Office of Legislative Affairs. They call them legislative liaisons. Yeah. They all have offices up here on the Hill. So, the Marines, the Air Force, the Army, they're the ones who run all the congressional delegations. They're the ones who provide the air travel for, sending members overseas to visit bases and things like that. So all those branches have their own offices of legislative affairs, but then the Office of the Secretary of Defense has his own legislative affairs office that's supposed to coordinate, communicate with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so I was in that role to help execute. Again, I'm there working for the secretary, but primarily I'm there for Trump, right? I'm there to help ensure that the Trump administration's priorities and policies are communicated to and defended on Capitol Hill. Yeah. And so then I worked primarily with the House Armed Services Committee and, of course, congressional leadership, Speaker Pelosi, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, helping, execute briefings and hearings. And it was a great job, man. I loved it.
Yeah. And so this would have been, so you said you did 3 years at State.
Yeah.
And so this would have been like.
This was 2020.
2020.
Yeah.
Boy, tell us about that. What were some of the big fights that were going on over at DOD?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one of the main things we do is work on the NDAA.
Yeah.
The national, I was like, how am I blanking on this massive bill? The National Defense Authorization Act. So that was like right when I got over there, jumped into helping kind of shepherd that process through and defending administration priorities through that. But yeah, again, some of the biggest fights then, we were trying to get out of Afghanistan in a reasonable way. Yeah. Actually, I helped execute the first public hearing on sort of this Afghanistan peace plan that was proposed by, there was our special representative Khalilzad and then the State Department, DOD. We thought we had a pretty good plan in place, but it did not include, breaking glass and jumping out of there the way that the Biden administration ultimately did, which was a disaster. So worked on that, worked on the Afghanistan drawdown. And again, Trump was trying to ensure that going forward that folks like NATO and the Europeans and Germany, picked up their fair share of the tab for sort of mutual defense efforts over there. That was another thing that we were working on too, was trying to get some of our troops home, get our boys back home, and I guess boys and girls, get our boys back home.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Man.
That was, it was just he was trying to fulfill his promise to get us out of endless wars. And that was one of the biggest things I got to work on over there.
And so that 4 years in, still facing massive resistance, from the deep state, from, these unelected bureaucrats.
Unaccountable.
And unaccountable. Exactly. Yeah. How do we, I hate to be like, how do we fix it?
Yeah, sure.
But specifically, American Moment is part of how we fix it. But specifically at places like state and, the Department of Defense, where they're so focused on experts and security clearances and all these things, how do we get our guys in there, or at least, help curtail the influence of all these unaccountable bureaucrats?
Right. Well, we have built a massive security state apparatus that essentially runs our government at this point. There's a book out there called, I think it's called National Security and Double Government. And I'm blanking on the author's name right now, but he speaks to how, and he was looking at Britain first, but also in the United States, where there's this, elections come and go, presidents come and go, but the security state remains. Yeah. Right. And the security state, you could think of it as being composed of, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI, and then the NSA, and sort of all the proliferation of these other agencies. And then they all work through the National Security Council, the NSC over at the White House, which is sort of the clearinghouse for the president in terms of these policies and goals. And so this, there are career, they're staffed primarily by 90+% career individuals, right? They're not people who are there to serve this president. They're just there to serve in perpetuity in these roles as experts, right?
Right.
And it's so funny. In DC, being an expert literally just means that you believe what everybody has told you to believe, and you're here to defend it.
Yeah, you have Ukraine flag in bio.
That's right. Yeah, it's just these people. The only thing that makes them an expert is that they've been saying the same thing for 15 years without ever considering how the world has changed around them.
Yeah.
And so President Trump has proposed this Schedule F. Yep. Which is fantastic. And not only do we need to get our guys in, we need to get these guys out. Obviously, the federal bureaucracy is bloated. It could be significantly reduced. There's a lot of redundancies. Even think of what happened, what we saw this past week. I don't know if you saw this video of Samantha Powers, who's the administrator of the USAID. Yep. Right. So one of the things Trump proposed, and I think is brilliant and should happen. USAID needs to be folded back into the State Department. Yeah. We don't need a separate USAID and State Department. Quite frankly, I think we could cut the whole USAID just in general, get rid of it. But she's over there filming and essentially publicly announcing that we're going to use American taxpayer dollars to sort of start funding a color revolution in Hungary, right? Because they use these phrases like media accountability, and what that means is they're going to fund media in Hungary that's going to counter the pro-Christian, pro-conservative, pro-family agenda over there, right? They're going to promote, they say, good governance and democracy. Okay, what they mean by that is the LGBTQ agenda, right? And those are going to go to George Soros societies, so open society funded organizations, and so all that stuff has to go. But you have to realize, I guess what I'm trying to say here, Nick, is you have to realize the euphemisms that the security state uses to execute its agenda. Good governance, media accountability.
Buzzwords.
The buzzwords, right? Yeah. What do they really mean?
Yeah, speaking of the LGBTQ agenda, we can talk about something else that usually goes hand in hand with that, which is support for intervention in Ukraine.
Yeah. Seriously.
So I think this is one of the areas that we've seen, the deep state really bounce back. I mean, just immediately after the Trump administration,
the deep state strikes back.
Yeah, they just rolled straight into cool. We're gonna direct a just ungodly amount of money, to this country
Yeah.
halfway across the world. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, because I want to go deeper than, because a lot of people want to say Trump wouldn't have gotten us into that mess, but I want to go deeper than that, because I don't necessarily think that is 100% the case. Like I think he would have some strategic. I'm curious to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important things to note about the whole Ukraine-Russia fiasco is that the Germans are deeply, deeply responsible for this. Their greed and their desire for the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the purpose of that is for them to buy, gas from Russia and get it into Europe, was one of the driving factors of this fight. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, they eventually stopped short of a major gas line there that Russian gas goes through, and they didn't want to destroy that. So that kind of held their ground. And so with the potential completion and the coming online of Nord Stream 2, I think Russia felt like they had the green light to go grab more land in Ukraine. And the Germans are deeply responsible for that. President Trump, told the Germans to their face that this was going to happen, and they laughed at him, and it happened. And he told the Germans they need to do more to fund defense of Europe, and they don't do it, right? So the Germans are deeply to blame. I think Trump, again, was one of the most successful foreign policy presidents we ever had. But one of the things we left on the board was, completely shutting down that pipeline in a legal and constitutional fashion. Yeah. We could talk about maybe what Biden has done since then, as opposed to blowing it up, seriously. And so the Germans are deeply at fault here. And quite frankly, this is a European problem. And honestly, a lot of people don't know this, but Germans actually have a fair bit of antipathy for the Ukrainians. So they don't really care about them. So they kind of led them into this mess in many ways, don't care about them. But fundamentally, this is a European issue, right? And so the European allies, Germany, France, the UK, they're the ones who need to be dealing with this. Like Russia's encroaching upon territory that's adjacent to them, not us. Yeah. And so I think that if Trump were in office, would Putin have had the guts to invade? I don't know. And had that happened, I think our response would certainly look different. And one of the main ways our response would look different is that we would not be sort of continuing to fund European apathy towards this, but forcing them to step up and take accountability for the foreign policy mess on their own soil.
Yeah. One of the things that I'd be curious to hear about there too is like NATO. What would Trump's relationship with NATO be like? What would he be charging them to do, in this circumstance?
Well, look, NATO is clearly in some ways like outliving its usefulness, right? I mean, what is the point of NATO if the Russians are going to do this? And of course, Ukraine's not a NATO ally, and thank the Lord for that, right?
Yeah. Not for lack of trying.
Yeah, and we absolutely should not let them into NATO. But so, I think, again, we constantly pressured NATO allies to step up and fund more of the NATO efforts and to take more seriously the threats that are most adjacent and, concerning to NATO partners. And so I think that we would be pressuring NATO in such a way that would cause sort of like the derision and the scorn of the foreign policy establishment, as it always did, if Trump was in office right now. And maybe, quite frankly, we would tell NATO, like, this is your problem, deal with it. And as much as it is, again, Ukraine is not a NATO treaty ally. So I think that's critical. And I think in some ways you want to keep NATO out of it. You want to keep NATO out of it to a certain extent because we don't want to get embroiled in a land war with Russia. Yeah. That's always a good rule.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, it may be shocking to some of our viewers and listeners to be like, wait a minute. This is the guy I see online, like, tweeting about Christian nationalism. Where's all this, like, where's the Christian nationalism guy? Why are we talking about all this security state stuff? So what kind of happened to you after, the end of the Trump administration? Like, what you went to seminary? What went wrong? What happened?
Yeah, no, nothing went wrong. I mean, these are all connected, right? I mean, I have like I said, the issues I'm interested in, I really do think are like America first issues. And that involves both our presence abroad and our posture here at home. And I am sort of an unapologetic nationalist in the most like basic and positive sense of that word, right? I think that nations should look out for themselves first and foremost. In fact, as a Christian, I think the governments of nations are responsible for their citizens. Christians first and foremost, right? God is going to hold the United States government accountable in whatever way that looks like, for how they care for American citizens, fundamentally, not how they care for citizens of the world, right? There's no such thing as a global citizen. This is also, part of the issue with foreign policy and Christian nationalism is this idea that, we're this cosmopolitan, globalized society. And, now, quite frankly, a lot of our elites are that, right? They travel the world, they're globe hopping. And, Obama said, I'm a citizen of the world. And that's just not true, right? Like, you're a citizen of a country. So during my time in the administration, my time here in DC, I just became increasingly aware of how I think that the vast majority of evangelical Christians in America are getting just absolute junk public theology from many of our leading organizations who speak to these issues. And so, quite frankly, whether that was from someone like Russell Moore or David French or Tim Keller, I think those guys have little to nothing meaningful to say to how American Christians need to think about, engaging in the public arena in a rapidly secularizing, or you could say paganizing, society. And so I want to help Christians in particular think better about what is the role of our faith in the public square. And that kind of led me into the Christian nationalism path.
Yeah. So what is it exactly that you're doing now? Because I think a lot of people might see you online. They're like, oh, he tweets all day. Cool. Yeah. What is it that you're doing to solve that problem?
Yeah. Well, so I, after my time in the Trump administration, instead of trying to go get a job as a lobbyist at Raytheon or something like that, I went to seminary because I want to make sure that I credential and educate myself to be qualified to speak to these issues, which I'm against credentialism in general, but it's good to do the study. And so I finished my Masters of Divinity and am now doing a Masters of Theology, in which I hope to particularly explore sort of a systematic theology of the role and scope of civil government. What are governments accountable to God to do and to provide for their citizens? And so I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, finishing up my seminary work there. I have had a chance to, have to, put my family through school here again. So I've had a chance to get involved with organizations like the Freedom Center out of Liberty University. So I write regularly for them, and now a Center for Renewing America. And so, Twitter, I use Twitter, quite frankly, as like a work tool, right? So totally. when I'm tweeting, I'm working in many ways. I'm trying to get ideas out there and advance these causes that we're committed to. So,
yeah, and you are a Baptist, correct?
Yes.
So this is
a based Baptist.
A based Baptist. So you mentioned, your college was you said PCA college. So normally you see it going the other way, like Baptists, joining the PCA or the OPC or something like that. How did you do the reverse?
Yeah, well, I love all the topics we're covering here. I hope folks find this really interesting. I grew up going to a PCA church. And my parents are wonderful. I love them. They are both first generation Christians. Neither one of them grew up in a Christian household. My dad's brilliant, and he was at that time. He was. We grew up going to Presbyterian church, though my dad wasn't necessarily committed Presbyterian, so it wasn't like we're Presbyterians, And then I didn't actually become a Christian until after college. So I was one of those guys who said a prayer when I was 9 years old, but that doesn't make you a Christian, right? Yeah. And so I don't think I actually understood the gospel, repented of my sins, and trusted in Christ for salvation until I got out of college. And after that, when I came here to Capital Baptist Church, they explained hey, you've never been baptized upon your profession of faith, and this is something that Scripture commands Christians to do. And so I had no problem, being baptized upon my profession of faith. And at that point in time, when I was, evaluating things again, because I was never sort of confessionally or culturally a Presbyterian, I was, this was over 10 years ago. I was like, what? I believe this. This is what I believe. And I think it's clear that this is what Scripture teaches. And so I became a Baptist.
Yeah. So I'm interested. The reason I asked that question is because I want to pull that together with the Christian nationalism thing, because a lot of the scholars, people that are writing about this stuff, doing this sort of work, are Presbyterians, or you get a lot of Anglicans too, very high church. And I think there's not very much discussion about if I were to put it in the terms that you used, can Baptists be based?
Yeah, that's
like,
right.
like what's the, because it's tied up in a lot of like covenant theology and that sort of thing. So how would you differ from a lot of the Presbyterians that are Christian nationalists versus your Baptist version?
Baptist political theology and public theology has been pretty weak over the last century. It's not always been that way. We've had some brilliant Baptist thinkers who have addressed these issues, I think, from a much more serious perspective, like Andrew Fuller and John Gill. Those would be two names just off the top of my head. And even someone like Carl F.H. Henry, who started Christianity Today. I mean, he has this incredible line in his like 6-volume commentary, God, Revelation, and Authority, where he says, like, civilization has to return to the bedrock truth of Scripture or it's going to fall apart. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. I use that quote as the start of a paper I did on Baptist and Christian nationalism. So first, I want to differentiate myself from a lot of Baptists, because I think that a lot of Baptists think very poorly about the role of the civil government and the way that it actually should be encouraging, Christian values and morality in the public square. And then, so where I'd be different from Presbyterians is, they would sort of argue that their understanding of the church structure, where you have sort of a covenant community where infants are baptized into it with the expectation that they're going to assume sort of ownership of the faith later on in life, can translate to the state. And I don't necessarily disagree with them in the sense that I don't think that everybody within a community has to be a Christian for you to call it a Christian community, right? I think you can have Christian families where not everybody is a Christian. You can have Christian schools, not everybody is a Christian. I think you can have a Christian nation, even if not everybody in that nation is a Christian. You're gonna get all the Theo roast in the comments accusing you of federal vision by saying that. Well, I'm not, but yeah, sure. So I mean, I think I think I just have great common cause with a lot of Presbyterians in terms of our what they're looking for the government to do in terms of promoting the common good and civic virtue. Yeah. There's a lot of brouhaha, I guess is the way I'll put it, about this Christian nationalism stuff. I mean, you got NBC reporters like writing big exposés, right-wing conspiracy to have a Christian town. You have a lot of people online attempting to, fight over kind of like principles and philosophy and that sort of thing. What I think is, funnily enough, not talked about frequently enough is the actual practical application. Like what would a Christian nation, run by Christian nationalists, what would that look like? Apparently, it'd be really scary. Apparently, it's like Handmaid's Tale. Yeah, seriously. No, I mean, it's basic stuff. And that's where, to me, the bedwetting over Christian nationalism just makes me chuckle, right? The way I got into this, I joke, like, as a good Reformed bro, that I didn't choose Christian nationalism chose me. Because I read this book. I mean, so many people have read it, right? By Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, Taking America Back for God. And you can see, and they're against this stuff now, by the way. They've always been against it. Yeah. So in this book, they try to, honestly, Nick, we're only having this Christian nationalism conversation because Trump won in 2016. Yeah. Right. And so Trump wins in 2016, and people go searching for the reason that Trump was able to pull this off. And a lot of these sort of sociologists and these academics sort of settled on, it's Christian nationalism. That's how he won. These scary Christian nationalists put Trump in office. And, so they write this book, Taking America Back for God, and in it, they essentially, they're regime propagandists who are trying to invent a scary sounding term to describe Christians in the public square voting for their values. Yeah. Right. So honestly, I would like people who are hesitant about the term Christian nationalism, hear me say this. If you're a Christian who votes for your values in the public square and wants to see things like life protected, marriage defended, transgenderism stopped, our borders secured, our government serving our interests, banning pornography, congratulations, you're a Christian nationalist, right? And here's the thing is, I just find it completely unconvincing those who argue that what got us here will get us there. And what get us there being a vision of our life here, our communal life in America that isn't marred by sort of the filth that we're witnessing currently. Like what stops, how does classic liberalism stop William Thomas from competing with women, at the collegiate level and exposing himself to them as has been reported now repeatedly, right? What tools does classic liberalism or principled pluralism have to say that we're going to get William Thomas out of the girls' locker room? I mean, that's what got William Thomas into the girls' locker room, right? So I'm just unconvinced by the competing visions out there. And Christian nationalism, to me, if this is what it is very convincing.
The reason I say that about the book, saying that they're against it now, is because I think the title is hilarious.
Oh yeah,
Taking America Back for God. Right. Yes. Yeah. Like right. let's do just that. I think one of the in our own way, of course.
Sure.
I think one of the interesting things about all this discourse is I think you'll get some people who are not who haven't read into it as much, will say things like, oh, we just need to go back to the 1950s or insert time frame before the 1960s,
sure.
When things were better. What kinds of things do you think? Because I don't think that's quite the answer.
Sure.
That we can just roll the clock back and everything will be fine. What kinds of things are kind of baked into the cake, as it were, and we just need to figure out?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, right? I'm not. America does have an interesting history, right? Like, and I do think I want to recognize that for certain groups in America, when you talk about like going back, I don't want any of Black brothers and sisters to feel like we want to go back to an era of like segregation and Jim Crow, right?
Yeah.
But that's so we've been working to resolve those fundamental contradictions and sins of our past here in America in reasonable ways, but that movement's been totally hijacked now, right? Also, I don't want to go back to 1973 either, when Roe v. Wade was, put into law, right? So we've had some major moral failings, and we have a continual major moral failing in America with, the presence of on-demand abortion, which is still legal more or less in almost all 50 states, right? Like, I mean, there are many states now in a Dobbs world where abortions are being significantly curtailed. So yeah, I don't think just going back isn't the answer. We need to chart a path forward and try to work for a consensus on what it means to promote the common good and human flourishing, and what the role of the government is in stopping the spread of dangerous ideologies and, quite frankly, destructive behaviors, right? So like liberals, there's a great essay by Jacqueline Lang on modern liberalism and like from a legal standpoint, in which she argues that sort of like modern liberalism, the theory of the sort of personal autonomy, has given us collectively the right to like destroy our civilization. Because it's this idea that unless I'm doing something that causes you physical harm, the government has no role intervening, right? Yeah. Well, look, man, looking at pornography on your computer screen causes you moral, spiritual, and real harm, right? Like, and that's not something necessarily that the government should just like turn a blind eye to, right? Drag queens, reading to kids is a real harm. It's not a physical harm, but it is a harm. And so that's just one thing in particular. We need conservatives and, Christians and everybody to wrap their minds around the fact that the government has a role in, preventing real moral and spiritual harms that are proliferating across our country right now unchecked.
Yeah, you're hitting on a great point here. I think you end up with American Christians in particular with these libertarian tendencies, right? They think,
libertarians.
Yeah, we've grown up in this kind of pluralistic, society, and like, yes, I'm a Christian, but that's my Muslim neighbor that lives 3 doors down is like really, really nice, and I don't want to do anything to like offend them. You kind of end up with folks who don't really want to take a particular, stance on a lot of like social, moral, cultural, religious issues. Why is that the wrong approach?
Well, I can certainly sympathize with people who want a smaller government. But somebody said the other day, I can't remember who it was I was talking to. Oh, yeah, now I can remember. I won't use his name, though. He said, like, And he's a conservative. He said, I'm not primarily concerned about a smaller government. I want a good government. And now I think those go hand in hand, right? I think the bigger your government is, the worse it's going to be. So I can sympathize with the libertarian impulse for smaller government, for government that stays out of our lives in the ways that it should stay out of our lives. And the reality is, in America, the government is involved in our lives in all sorts of ways that it should not be. But the problem with the libertarian impulse is that then they cannot see the places where a good government should be stepping in, right? So there was a recent, we don't have to get into names, but like there's a recent debate over, I believe it's a bill that's either been introduced or being proposed by Josh Hawley, Senator Hawley, on requiring users of social media to be 16.
Yep.
And there are some serious Christians out there who would share many of my beliefs and desires for like Christian nationalism, Christian nation, or mere Christendom, who are saying that this is the government going too far. And I think that's actually a decent debate to have, right? I mean, we understand, again, thinking about what real harm is, right?
Yeah.
We understand that, we say you have to be 18 years old to buy a pack of cigarettes, right? So how much harm does smoking do to physically? Well, how much harm is social media doing to our teenagers spiritually, morally, and psychologically? I mean, there is all across the board, there is an uptick in depression, in suicides, in sort of hopelessness and despair in the next generation. And I would pin most of that on the fact that they're, spending, 5 hours a day watching TikTok videos.
Yeah.
Which quite frankly, the real Chinese spy balloon is TikTok anyway.
Yeah.
And we need to ban it, right? So I think that there's a serious debate to be had about if that is an appropriate role of government. And I think libertarians just aren't thinking clearly when it comes to that issue.
Yeah. And this is not to discount, these sorts of guys. There are several people that I'm thinking of right now, like all doing great work, very important guys, very, very faithful Christians.
Yep.
But I think like a lot of the reading through a couple of the pieces that have been written about this, this kind of like, one of the responses that I see is like, oh, well, do you, not want to have the age to drink alcohol be 21? And they're like, no, it's like your parents' responsibility to like manage that. I would get rid of that and to really just say like the government should be out of like kind of all of these social things, and it should be up to your parents to sort that out. What kinds of things do you think are going to be missed if we go down that path, and not just like social media? I mean, any potpourri of issues. If you take this kind of ideological conclusion down the line, if we had a libertarian, somewhat Christian nation, like what would that look like? Where are some pitfalls where that could go wrong? Well,
I don't think you can ultimately have a libertarian Christian nation, right?
Exactly.
I would understand libertarianism and sort of Christian nationism, Christian nationalism to be in contradiction with each other, because the libertarian approach is this idea that the government is somehow some sort of like morally neutral arbiter that is sort of just intervening in your affairs when sort of like you're being denied justice, or your physical life and property and person is being impeded upon by somebody else. And I just think that honestly is a fundamentally unchristian approach, right? Like, so you could have that conversation on the grounds of just sort of political theory, but then from a Christian perspective, we recognize that all laws are moral judgments, and what a government does and does not enforce sends a moral signal to the population about what's permissible and what isn't. And so right now, we essentially have progressive LGBT nationalism in our country right now. And so many of our government's, laws, and you think about like the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, right?
Yeah.
That is a religious bill. That sends a religious message to our country about what marriage is and isn't, right? And so like, that's like sort of the polar opposite of Christian nationalism. And I know our Christian brothers who are libertarians don't follow this argument through to its logical conclusion, but so many libertarians here around Capitol Hill. I mean, it is crazy, man. Back when I was working on the Hill, in the run up to Obergefell, how many Republican staffers, just parroted this line: the government has no business being involved in marriage. Like, are you kidding me? That's like one of the most important things the government should be seeking to preserve and protect,
right?
Which is traditional marriage, which is the only marriage. There's no other thing that's marriage other than one man, one woman united for life. And so I think that, that's what you get. At the end of the day, if you follow the libertarian impulse and path, you get to a conclusion like the government has no business being in marriage.
Yeah.
And that's absurd.
Yeah. The Defense of Marriage Act is their creed for their progressive and LGBTQ religion.
Yeah.
Well, William, thanks so much for coming on. Where can people find you, keep up with the things that you're writing, the things that you're working on, and keep up with all the things you're going to be doing in the future?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram too, and also on Gab. I hang out over there with some friends from time to time. And then I write regularly for the Freedom Center out of Liberty University. That's the Standing for Freedom Center. They're doing fantastic work, really sort of defending, Christian truth and values and bringing a Christian perspective to these issues. One of the things I try to do there is I try to give Christians, pastors, people in the pews, sort of alternative and better takes on the most pressing public issues of the day, right? Like, quite frankly, I'm not going to send somebody to the Gospel Coalition, but I would send someone to Freedom Center. And so you can find me there, and also now a visiting fellow with the Center for Renewing America, where I'll be continuing to engage on issues related to foreign policy and Christian nationalism, and try to help restore this. The mission of Center for Renewing America is to restore the consensus, that for God, for country, for community, right? And I think that's critical. So you can find me there, and here on the American Moment podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for all of that information, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Nick.
I told you that was going to be quite an episode. Make sure to look for all the things that William's writing and working on. He's going to be doing a lot of interesting things over the coming years, and we look forward to seeing all of it. As always, please subscribe to our podcast. If you're on YouTube, hit the little bell to be notified when a new episode or a new clip drops. You can find more information about American Moment and all of our programming at AmericanMoment.org. And we thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.